This is the story of Napoleon Bonaparte, a man born on a remote island who rose to command armies, crown himself emperor, and change the fate of nations. Welcome to Fall Asleep Too. If long, gentle journeys through history, philosophy, and the stars bring you comfort, consider subscribing so you'll always have another story waiting. Now, get comfortable, let the world grow quiet, and let's get started. Napoleon Bonaparte's story begins far from the glittering halls of Paris or the battlefields of Europe. It begins on the rugged island of Corsica, a place of wild mountains, olive groves, and restless seas. Corsica had long been a land of independence, proud of its traditions and resistant to outside control. Only shortly before Napoleon's birth had the island been taken by France from the Republic of Genoa, and the people of Corsica were not quick to accept this new rule. It was into this atmosphere of resistance and tension that Napoleon was born in the year 1769. His family belonged to the minor nobility, a proud but not wealthy household. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was a lawyer with ties to Corsican patriots, while his mother, Letizia Ramolino, was known for her strength, discipline, and resilience. She would have many children, but Napoleon was destined to stand apart from them all. As a boy, Napoleon grew up surrounded by stories of heroism and rebellion. Corsica's greatest leader, Pasquale Paoli, was spoken of with reverence in his household, and the dream of independence stirred the imagination of the young child. Yet history often turns in unexpected directions, and though Napoleon's earliest loyalties were to Corsica, the course of his life would tie him forever to France. When Napoleon was still a child, his father secured a scholarship for him to study at military schools in France. It was a chance that would shape his future, though it also meant leaving behind the familiar hills of Corsica for a distant land where his accent and origins made him an outsider. In France, Napoleon discovered that his Corsican identity set him apart. His classmates mocked his rough manners and provincial speech. He was small for his age, serious and often withdrawn. Yet he also possessed a sharp mind, a relentless curiosity, and a fierce determination to prove himself. At the military academy in Brienne, Napoleon immersed himself in studies of mathematics, history, and the art of war. He read voraciously, especially the works of great historians and philosophers. He admired Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, seeing in them the examples of what one extraordinary individual could accomplish. His teachers noted his talent for artillery, a branch of the military that demanded both precision and intellect. Even then, Napoleon's mind was drawn not only to theory, but also to practical solutions, to the mechanics of battle, and to the question of how a single man could bend events to his will. Though he longed at first to return to Corsica, destiny was guiding him toward a broader stage. After completing his education, he joined the French army as a young officer. In those years, France itself was teetering on the edge of transformation. The monarchy was deeply in debt, the people were restless, and new ideas about liberty, equality, and the rights of man were spreading through every corner of society. Napoleon entered adulthood just as the French Revolution erupted, a tidal wave that would sweep away the old world and create opportunities for those bold enough to seize them. At first, the revolution was a confusing and chaotic time. The king still reigned, but power was slipping away from the monarchy. Crowds filled the streets of Paris. Assemblies debated endlessly. In distant provinces, peasants and townspeople rose up against nobles and landlords. The old order trembled, and with it, the structures that had kept ambitious young men like Napoleon in fixed positions. Suddenly, merit and ability mattered more than birth, and the army, desperate for officers, opened its doors to those who could prove themselves. Napoleon's early career coincided with these turbulent years. He remained deeply attached to Corsica at first, returning to his island with revolutionary ideals, hoping to serve both his homeland and the new France. But Corsican politics were bitterly divided, and soon Napoleon found himself at odds with Paoli, the hero he had once admired. Forced to choose between the independence of Corsica and his growing loyalty to France, Napoleon sided with France. It was a decision that cost him his place on the island. His family was driven out, their home attacked, their safety threatened. They fled to the mainland, exiles in the very country that was now Napoleon's only future. In France, Napoleon threw himself into his military duties. His rise was not immediate. He was still an unknown officer, ambitious, but untested. Yet fate soon placed him in situations where his skills could shine. One of the earliest came in the city of Toulon. Royalists there had invited the British Navy to occupy the port, turning it into a stronghold against the revolution. Retaking the city was vital, and Napoleon, still a young artillery officer, devised a daring plan. He positioned the cannons with such skill that the French were able to drive out the British and reclaim the harbour. This victory was more than just a military success. It was the moment when Napoleon's name first began to circulate beyond his circle of friends and comrades. The leaders of the revolution noticed him, recognizing not only his ability, but also his confidence, his willingness to take responsibility, and his sharp intelligence. In a time when France desperately needed capable men, Napoleon had announced himself as someone to watch. Yet the revolution was unstable, and fortunes rose and fell quickly. Political factions clashed, alliances shifted, and many who had risen high found themselves suddenly condemned, even executed. Napoleon himself was briefly imprisoned, accused of association with a fallen leader. For a time, it seemed his career might end before it had truly begun, but once again, chance intervened. He was released, and not long after, an opportunity arose that would secure his position. In Paris, a royalist uprising threatened to overthrow the government. The leaders turned to Napoleon for help. He responded decisively, ordering artillery to sweep the streets with grapeshot, breaking the insurrection with ruthless efficiency. It was a harsh solution, but it saved the government, and in doing so, it made Napoleon a national figure. From that day, he was no longer just a talented officer, he was a rising star. Behind this rise was a man still shaped by his Corsican childhood, by years of being an outsider, by his determination to master whatever challenges lay before him. He was ambitious, restless, and already convinced that he was destined for something greater. Though he had begun as a boy from a small island, mocked for his accent and doubted for his size, Napoleon had carved his way into the centre of the most powerful revolution in Europe. As the revolution continued to convulse, tearing down the monarchy, rewriting laws, and fighting wars on every border, Napoleon was poised to move ever higher. His story had only just begun, and already it carried the mark of destiny, a mixture of talent, opportunity, and the relentless drive of a man who believed the world was his to conquer. Napoleon Bonaparte's rise from obscurity to prominence was not the story of slow, steady advancement. It was instead a tale of sudden leaps, moments of crisis where he revealed his gifts and seized opportunities that others missed. After Toulon and the uprising in Paris, his reputation as a man of action was established. But reputations are fragile in revolutionary France, and the path to greatness was never smooth. The revolution itself was still turbulent. France was surrounded by enemies: Austria, Prussia, Britain, and later many others. Inside the country, royalists plotted to restore the monarchy, while radical factions fought for control of the government. It was in this atmosphere of danger and uncertainty that Napoleon's career unfolded. For him, every battle, every assignment, was not just about serving the Republic. It was also about survival and advancement. One of the qualities that distinguished Napoleon early on was his mastery of artillery. In an age when battles were often decided by cavalry charges and lines of musket fire, Napoleon understood the power of well-placed cannons. He saw them not as static weapons, but as instruments of movement, precision, and strategy. At Toulon, he had demonstrated this vision by turning the tide with carefully positioned batteries. In Paris, he had unleashed them against the royalist mob with devastating effect. For Napoleon, the cannon was more than a weapon. It was the language in which he spoke best. Yet for all his talents, his career still depended on fortune and politics. After his early triumphs, he was rewarded with a general's rank. But soon, he fell into disfavour. Factional struggles in Paris meant that those once favoured could be discarded overnight. For a time, Napoleon found himself without command, restless and uncertain. He spent long months in Paris, walking the streets, reading voraciously, and waiting for another chance. He also began to move in new circles, meeting politicians, writers, and women who were drawn to his intensity. Among them was Josephine de Beauharnais, a widow with connections in high society, who would later become central to his life. But before love came destiny, and destiny called in the form of Italy. By the mid-1790s, France was at war with Austria, and the Italian campaign was faltering. The generals in charge were cautious and uninspired, their armies poorly supplied and weary. The government decided to gamble on a young commander, still barely in his mid-20s. They appointed Napoleon to lead the army of Italy. For many, it seemed a strange choice. He was young, untested as a commander of thousands, and from a background that did not inspire confidence among older officers. But those who doubted him would soon be silenced. Napoleon's arrival in Italy was the beginning of his legend. The army he inherited was ragged and demoralized. Soldiers lacked shoes, food, and pay. They were weary of endless marches through rough mountains, disheartened by defeats and skeptical of their new leader. Napoleon addressed them directly, with words that blended honesty and inspiration. He reminded them that they were hungry and poorly clothed, but he promised them glory, honor, and riches if they would follow him. His speeches were simple, direct, and full of confidence. The men responded. Then came the test of battle. In a series of rapid maneuvers through the spring of 1796, Napoleon transformed the campaign. He struck first at the Piemontese, forcing them into submission, then turned against the Austrians. His genius lay not only in tactics, but in the speed with which he moved. He marched his men through mountain passes where the enemy thought it impossible, outflanked stronger forces, and divided his opponents so that he could defeat them one by one. At Montenotte, he won a swift victory that announced his arrival. At Lodi, he famously led his men across a narrow bridge under heavy fire, urging them forward with courage that captured their imaginations. Though the battle itself was not decisive, it became a symbol. His soldiers began to call him the Little Corporal, a term of affection and respect, recognizing that he shared their dangers and inspired their trust. The Italian campaign soon became a cascade of triumphs. City after city opened its gates to him, either conquered or compelled to surrender. His victories at Castiglione, Arcole, and Rivoli cemented his reputation as a commander of brilliance. Each time, he used daring maneuvers, quick marches, and carefully concentrated artillery to overwhelm larger forces. His enemies found themselves outthought, outmaneuvered, and outfought by an army that only months earlier had been in despair. But Napoleon's genius was not confined to the battlefield. He understood the importance of politics, propaganda, and image. He made sure that his victories were celebrated in Paris, sending back glowing reports that painted him as the saviour of France. Newspapers praised him, and his fame spread quickly. He also negotiated treaties and reshaped the map of Italy, creating new republics that served as allies of France. By the time the campaign ended, Austria had been forced to sign the Treaty of Campo Formio, ceding vast territories and recognizing French dominance in northern Italy. Napoleon returned to France not just as a victorious general, but as a national hero. Crowds cheered him in the streets. Artists painted his likeness. Writers praised his genius. He was no longer simply a soldier. He was becoming a figure of destiny. Yet with fame came ambition. Napoleon was restless, and though he had achieved wonders in Italy, he longed for new challenges. The revolution in Paris was still unstable, with leaders mistrusted and governments rising and falling. The people were weary of political squabbles. Many began to look toward Napoleon as someone who could bring order and strength. But before he seized political power, his path would take him eastward, to a land of ancient wonders and dangerous dreams. Egypt. For now, though, Italy had revealed him. He had taken a starving, ragged army and turned it into a force that defeated one of Europe's great powers. He had shown courage at Lodi, vision at Rivoli, and relentless energy throughout. More than victories, he had gained something deeper, the loyalty of his soldiers, the admiration of his nation, and the belief that he was destined for greatness. The boy from Corsica, mocked for his accent and ignored for his birth, had become the most celebrated commander of his age. Cannons and courage had carried him far, and the world was beginning to take notice. The Italian campaign was more than just a series of victories. It was the crucible in which Napoleon Bonaparte transformed from a promising officer into a legend. The rugged landscapes of northern Italy, its valleys, rivers, and mountains, became the stage where he proved not only his military skill, but also his to inspire men, outwit adversaries, and bend fortune to his will. When Napoleon first arrived in Italy in the spring of 1796, his army was worn down by hunger and exhaustion. Supplies were scarce, pay was long overdue, and morale was dangerously low. Many soldiers doubted that their new commander, a man still in his mid-20s with a Corsican accent and slight frame, could change their fortunes. But Napoleon understood something essential. Before he could win battles, he had to win hearts. Standing before his troops, he spoke with both frankness and vision. He acknowledged their suffering, the long marches, the lack of shoes, the empty bellies. But then he painted a picture of glory, fertile valleys waiting to be claimed, riches to be won, honor to be gained. He told them that under his command, they would not only be soldiers, but conquerors, remembered for their victories. His words carried conviction, and the men, stirred by his energy, began to believe. Napoleon wasted no time. He struck first at the Piedmontese, who were allied with Austria. At Montenotte, his clever manoeuvres overwhelmed them, forcing their surrender. It was his first victory as commander, and it sent a clear signal. The young general knew how to win. Next, he turned on the Austrians, who were larger in number but scattered. Napoleon moved with speed, outflanking them, cutting their lines, and defeating them in detail. His strategy was simple yet brilliant. Keep the enemy divided, strike quickly, and never allow them to unite. One of the most memorable moments came at the Battle of Lodi. The Austrian army had retreated across a river, blowing the bridge to hinder pursuit. Napoleon, determined not to let them escape, ordered an attack. The bridge was narrow, the enemy cannons raked it with fire, and the soldiers hesitated. Napoleon, however, strode forward, urging his men to follow. Under withering fire, they charged across, bayonets gleaming, drums beating. The Austrians were driven back, and though the battle was not decisive, its impact on morale was immense. From that day, Napoleon's soldiers saw him not as a distant commander, but as one of them, willing to share their dangers. They began to call him the Little Corporal, a nickname that reflected both affection and respect. The bond between Napoleon and his army grew deeper with each victory, and his troops came to believe that under his command they could accomplish anything. Victory followed victory. At Castiglione, Napoleon outmaneuvered a larger Austrian force, striking them from multiple directions and forcing them into retreat. At Arcole, he once again led from the front, seizing a flag and urging his men forward through the marshes and across a deadly bridge. Though the battle raged for days and the fighting was brutal, Napoleon's determination carried the day. At Rivoli, perhaps his greatest triumph of the campaign, he faced an Austrian army determined to break through and relieve their garrisons. Using the high ground, swift movements, and devastating artillery fire, Napoleon crushed them, capturing thousands and securing control of northern Italy. Beyond the battlefield, Napoleon proved himself a master of politics and image. He issued proclamations to the conquered peoples of Italy, declaring that he had come not as an oppressor, but as a liberator, bringing the ideals of the revolution, liberty and equality. He dismantled old governments, established new republics, and reshaped borders. To many Italians, he was both a conqueror and a symbol of change. At the same time, he sent reports back to France that magnified his achievements, ensuring that his victories were celebrated in Paris with parades, songs, and poems. The campaign also revealed Napoleon's ambition. While his soldiers celebrated victories, he quietly negotiated with Austrian commanders, outmaneuvering diplomats as skillfully as he did generals. The culmination came with the Treaty of Campo Formio in 1797. Austria ceded vast territories, including Belgium and much of northern Italy, while France recognized Austrian control of other lands. It was a sweeping reordering of Europe, and Napoleon was at the center of it. For France, the Italian campaign was a triumph that restored national pride and expanded its influence. For Napoleon, it was a turning point. He had taken a starving, ragged army and turned it into a force that humbled one of Europe's greatest powers. His name was now spoken with awe, not just in France, but across the continent. He was hailed as a genius, a savior of the Republic, and perhaps even something more. But with triumph came questions. What would this young general do next? Would he remain loyal to the Republic? Or would his ambitions carry him further? In Paris, politicians admired his victories, but also feared his growing influence. They saw in him a man who commanded not only armies, but also the imagination of the people. And Napoleon himself, restless and ambitious, already looked beyond Italy. He dreamed of new campaigns, of new glories, of a destiny not yet fulfilled. The Italian campaign had made him famous, but it had also revealed his true nature, a man who could not be content with ordinary achievements, who sought not just victory, but greatness. The mountains of northern Italy had echoed with the sound of his cannons, and from those echoes, a legend was born. Napoleon returned to France a hero. Crowds lined the streets to see him. Artists painted his likeness, and songs were sung in his honor. He was no longer the obscure Corsican officer mocked for his accent. He was now the conqueror of Italy, the darling of the Republic, the general who had defied odds and triumphed. Yet even in his moment of glory, his thoughts turned restlessly to the future. For Napoleon Bonaparte, victories were never enough. There was always another horizon, Another campaign, another chapter waiting to be written. And soon, that horizon would not be in Europe at all, but in the sands of Egypt, where ancient mysteries and modern ambitions would collide. Fresh from the triumphs of Italy, Napoleon Bonaparte returned to France as a hero. His victories had electrified the nation, given pride back to the Republic, and made his name one of the most celebrated in Europe. Yet Napoleon was not a man who could rest on past glories. The Italian campaign had proven his genius, but he hungered for more. He sought not just military victories, but the creation of a legend that would endure beyond his lifetime. In Paris, the government, the Directory, viewed him with both admiration and unease. Napoleon was too young, too popular, and too ambitious to be entirely trusted. The Directory relied on him, but they also feared him. For now, they sought to keep him occupied, and Napoleon himself sought new horizons. His thoughts turned to the east. For centuries, Europe had looked upon the Orient with fascination. The deserts of Egypt, the Nile with its ancient mysteries, and the land of the pharaohs stirred imaginations with visions of timeless glory. Napoleon saw in Egypt both practical and symbolic opportunities. Practically, he hoped to strike at Britain by threatening its trade routes to India. Symbolically, he longed to follow in the footsteps of Alexander the Great, to carve out an empire that would blend conquest with enlightenment, war with discovery. In 1798, Napoleon embarked on his Egyptian expedition. It was an undertaking unlike any other in his career. He set sail not only with soldiers and cannons, but also with scientists, engineers, and scholars. His army carried with it the instruments of war, but also telescopes, presses, and notebooks. This was to be a conquest of both land and knowledge. The French would fight, but they would also study, measure, and record the wonders of the ancient land. The voyage itself was daring. The British Navy, under the vigilant eye of Admiral Horatio Nelson, dominated the seas. Yet Napoleon managed to slip past their patrols and bring his fleet safely to Egypt. There, the French army landed near Alexandria, the ancient city founded by Alexander himself. Napoleon stood on the sands of the desert, gazing upon the land that had inspired conquerors and scholars alike. The campaign began with dazzling speed. At the Battle of the Pyramids, Napoleon's army faced the Mamluks, the powerful warrior elite who ruled Egypt under the shadow of the Ottoman Empire. The French soldiers formed massive squares, walls of bayonets bristling on every side. Cavalry charges thundered against them, but broke apart, like waves against a rock. Napoleon pointed to the towering pyramids in the distance and declared, "Soldiers, from the heights of these monuments, 40 centuries look down upon you." With that, the French triumphed, defeating the Mamluks and entering Cairo in victory. Yet even as Napoleon celebrated, fate dealt him a crushing blow. At the Battle of the Nile, Admiral Nelson discovered the French fleet anchored at Aboukir Bay. In a brilliant night attack, Nelson destroyed or captured nearly the entire French navy. Napoleon and his army were stranded in Egypt, cut off from France, isolated in a foreign land. Still, Napoleon did not despair. He turned the setback into opportunity. In Cairo, he presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator, claiming respect for Islam and promising to bring progress and justice. He ordered his scholars to study the monuments, temples, and ruins. They catalogued plants and animals, mapped the land, and uncovered secrets that had been hidden for millennia. Among their discoveries was the Rosetta Stone, a slab of carved writing that would one day unlock the mystery of Egyptian hieroglyphs. But the dream of empire in Egypt soon collided with harsh realities. The land was vast, the people resistant, and the climate unforgiving. Uprisings flared, most violently in Cairo itself, where French soldiers were killed in street fighting. Napoleon crushed the revolt with brutal efficiency, but the unrest never truly subsided. Determined to expand his influence, Napoleon led an expedition into Syria. He besieged the city of Acre, hoping to push further into the Middle East. But here, his advance faltered. Disease ravaged his troops, supplies ran short, and the defenders, aided by the British Navy, held firm. After months of hardship, Napoleon was forced to retreat, his dream of sweeping into Asia shattered. By the summer of 1799, the Egyptian expedition was in decline. The French army was still strong, but cut off from reinforcements and plagued by sickness and resistance. Napoleon, ever restless, began to think not of the desert, but of Paris. France was again in political turmoil, its government weak and unpopular, its enemies abroad still threatening. Napoleon saw an opening. Quietly, he left Egypt, entrusting his army to others, and sailed back to France, evading the British once more. When he arrived in Paris, he was welcomed not as a man who had abandoned his army, but as a hero returning from distant adventures. Tales of the pyramids, of Cairo, of victories in the desert filled the imagination of the French people. They did not dwell on Acre or the loss of the fleet, but on the glory of the expedition, the discoveries, and the aura of greatness that surrounded their general. The Egyptian campaign was, in truth, a mixed success. Strategically, it had failed to cripple Britain or establish a lasting empire in the East. But in another sense, it had elevated Napoleon's legend. He had linked himself with the grandeur of antiquity, with pharaohs and conquerors, with scholars and discoveries. He had shown himself not only as a general of armies, but as a man of vision, a leader who sought to shape the world in both war and culture. And now, with his return to France, his path would no longer be confined to battlefields. The revolution had opened the door for change, and Napoleon, with his fame, ambition, and mastery of opportunity, was ready to step through it. Ahead lay not just campaigns and battles, but the crown itself. The sands of Egypt had tested him, stranded him, and forced him to dream of empire. But the streets of Paris would offer him something greater, the chance to seize power at the very heart of France. When Napoleon Bonaparte returned from Egypt in the autumn of 1799, France was once again on the brink of crisis. The revolution, which had promised liberty and stability, had instead delivered years of turmoil, shifting governments, and endless wars. The monarchy was gone. The guillotine had silenced kings and radicals alike, yet the promise of a new order still seemed unfulfilled. At the centre of this storm stood the Directory, the five-man government established after the fall of Robespierre. On paper, the Directory was designed to bring balance, to prevent both tyranny and chaos. In practice, it was weak, corrupt, and mistrusted. France's armies were still fighting abroad, victories mixed with defeats, while at home, the economy struggled and the people grew weary. The Directory had lost the confidence of both the public and the politicians. Into this weary, uncertain world stepped Napoleon, the hero of Italy and Egypt. His return electrified Paris. Crowds greeted him with cheers, newspapers praised his exploits, and his very presence seemed to promise a solution to France's troubles. He carried himself with calm assurance, speaking little, but allowing his fame to speak for him. Where the Directory appeared fragile and indecisive, Napoleon radiated strength and certainty. Ambitious men within the government saw in him the answer to their problems. If the Republic was to survive, they reasoned, it needed a leader who could command both respect and obedience. Some hoped they might use Napoleon to steady the ship of state, but Napoleon was not a man to be used by others. He was a man who intended to shape destiny himself. The plan took shape in November of 1799, in the month of Brumaire, according to the revolutionary calendar. Politicians plotted with Napoleon, offering him the chance to take control in what they believed would be a carefully managed transfer of power. Yet once the wheels were in motion, it was Napoleon who directed events. On the day of the coup, the chambers of government were surrounded by soldiers loyal to him. Deputies were summoned to a new meeting place outside Paris, told that danger threatened the Republic. Many were confused, suspicious, and fearful. Napoleon entered their assembly with his usual intensity, but his speech faltered. Accusations flew, tempers rose, and for a moment it seemed the plot might collapse. Deputies shouted him down, some even moved to declare him an outlaw. But outside the chamber, his brother Lucien, who presided over the assembly, rallied the soldiers. He declared that the deputies inside were threatened by extremists, and that only Napoleon could save France from anarchy. At Lucien's command, troops entered and dispersed the assembly. The coup was complete. The government of the Directory was swept aside, replaced by a new system, the consulate. At first, the consulate had 3 leaders, or consuls, but in reality, power lay firmly in Napoleon's hands. He became first consul, with authority greater than that of his colleagues. With this new position, he held the reins of France itself. Though the revolution had toppled kings, it had now delivered power to one man who, step by step, was moving toward monarchy in all but name. Napoleon understood the importance of appearances. He did not present himself as a dictator, but as the savior of the Republic. He promised stability, efficiency, and an end to the endless squabbles of politicians. He reorganized administration, reformed finances, and set about restoring order. The French, exhausted by years of upheaval, welcomed his firm hand. The coup of Brumaire marked the true turning point of his life. No longer just a general, Napoleon was now the political leader of France. His power rested not only on the loyalty of his soldiers, but on the belief that he alone could bring peace and prosperity. For many, he represented the culmination of the revolution, a man who rose by merit, not birth, who embodied the new France. Yet beneath the image of savior lay ambition. Napoleon was not content with being first consul. Already he envisioned a future where his authority would be unchallenged, where he would not merely guide the Republic, but remake it in his own image. His mind, restless and calculating, was filled with plans, reforms at home, victories abroad, and perhaps one day, a crown upon his head. In the months that followed the coup, he worked tirelessly to consolidate power. He reorganized the constitution, shaping it to strengthen his position. He cultivated loyalty among the army, the officials, and the people. He established himself not as a passing figure, but as the indispensable man of France. His authority grew quietly, steadily, until it seemed natural that he should lead. The revolution had begun with cries of liberty, equality, and fraternity. It had torn down the old order, toppled kings, and filled the streets of Paris with both hope and blood. Now, a decade later, it had delivered France into the hands of Napoleon Bonaparte, first consul, soldier, statesman, and soon something far more. The coup of Brumaire was bloodless compared to the storms that had come before, but its impact was immense. It ended the revolution as a period of uncertainty and ushered in the age of Napoleon. France, weary of chaos, embraced authority, and Napoleon, with cannons and courage behind him, stood ready to lead the nation into a new era. As first consul of France, Napoleon Bonaparte held a position of immense authority. Yet for all the reforms and victories that marked his early years in power, he was not a man to be satisfied with half measures. The title of consul, even first among 3, carried with it the echo of a fragile republic. Napoleon's ambition reached beyond that. He sought permanence, majesty, and the aura of a ruler who could not be cast aside with the next turn of politics. In the years after the coup of Brumaire, he worked tirelessly to reshape France. His genius was not only military, but also administrative. He reformed the taxation system, bringing order where corruption had drained the treasury. He founded the Bank of France, stabilizing finances. He oversaw the drafting of the Civil Code, later known as the Napoleonic Code, a body of law that simplified and unified rules across the nation. In every sphere, education, infrastructure, the military, Napoleon's hand left its mark. These reforms did more than strengthen the state. They also built his popularity. Ordinary citizens, weary of revolution and counter-revolution, saw in Napoleon a figure who brought stability. Farmers tilled their fields in peace. Merchants found new markets. Students entered schools that promised advancement by merit rather than birth. For the first time in years, life in France seemed steady. Yet Napoleon knew that stability was fragile unless bound to his own power. The institutions of the Republic could still, in theory, dismiss him. Factions might rise against him. To secure his place, he reached for something greater. He would become emperor. The idea shocked many, for the revolution had begun by tearing down a monarchy. Kings had been condemned as tyrants, the very idea of crowns and coronations denounced as relics of oppression. But Napoleon understood the psychology of power. Symbols mattered, titles mattered. If France was to follow him not merely as a general or consul, but as the enduring leader of a new age, then he needed the majesty of empire. In 1804, the Senate proclaimed him Emperor of the French. The people were asked to approve this transformation in a referendum, and the result was overwhelming support. Some were persuaded by his achievements, others by a desire for order, others still by the simple fact that Napoleon seemed destined to rule. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic coronations in history. On a cold December morning in Paris, in the Grand Cathedral of Notre Dame, the ceremony unfolded. The air was heavy with incense, the vaults echoing with music. Cardinals and bishops in glittering robes gathered. Nobles and officials filled the pews. The Pope himself, Pius VII, had travelled from Rome to officiate, lending sacred legitimacy to the event. Napoleon arrived in imperial robes, embroidered with golden bees, a symbol he had chosen to link his dynasty to ancient French kings while setting himself apart from them. He walked with calm authority, his gaze steady, his presence commanding. All eyes followed him as he approached the altar. Then came the moment that would live in legend. Traditionally, the Pope would place the crown upon the head of the sovereign, signifying the authority of the Church to bestow divine sanction. But Napoleon, never one to bow before another, took the crown in his own hands. Lifting it high, he placed it upon his head himself. With that gesture, he declared to the world that his authority came not from the Pope, not from tradition, but from himself, and from the will of the French people. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some saw arrogance, others saw genius, but none could mistake the symbolism. Napoleon had crowned himself. He was emperor by his own hand, ruler not by birthright, but by conquest, by merit, by destiny. Afterward, he placed a second crown upon the head of Josephine, his wife, elevating her to empress. She knelt before him, tears in her eyes, as he touched the crown to her hair. For all their personal struggles and his restless ambition, Napoleon ensured that Josephine shared in his glory, at least for that moment. The coronation was a spectacle designed to impress not only France, but all of Europe. Diplomats watched with unease, knowing that the balance of power had shifted. Napoleon was no longer a revolutionary general or a consul of a republic. He was a monarch in all but name, commanding an empire that stretched from the Atlantic to the Alps, from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. For the French people, the event carried deep meaning. To some, it was a betrayal of revolutionary ideals, a return to crowns and thrones. To others, it was the fulfillment of the revolution, a leader risen by talent, not birth, who now gave France stability and strength. For many more, it was simply a reassurance that after years of turmoil, France had a ruler who seemed both capable and unstoppable. In truth, the coronation marked not just the beginning of an empire, but also the beginning of Napoleon's greatest test. To be emperor was not merely to rule France, but to face the whole of Europe. Monarchs in Vienna, Berlin, and London looked upon him with fear and hostility. His very coronation was a challenge to the old order, a declaration that crowns were no longer the gift of ancient dynasties, but the prize of those who seized them. Napoleon had reached the pinnacle of power in France, but he would spend the next decade defending that power against the armies of kings and emperors, determined to bring him down. The crown he placed upon his head in Notre Dame was not only a symbol of triumph, it was also a target, drawing the eyes and armies of Europe toward him. Yet for that December day, in the echoing halls of the cathedral, Napoleon Bonaparte stood as the master of France, crowned by his own hand, elevated from soldier to emperor. His journey from the rocky island of Corsica, from the classrooms of Brienne, from the battlefields of Italy and the deserts of Egypt, had led him here. He was no longer merely a man of destiny, he was destiny itself. The coronation in Notre Dame had crowned Napoleon Emperor of the French, but the ceremony was only the beginning. To wear a crown in Paris was one thing, to defend it against the assembled monarchies of Europe was another. Napoleon knew that his empire would be tested not by words or ceremonies, but by battles. And in the years that followed, he would prove himself the master of Europe, defeating one coalition after another with a brilliance that reshaped the map of the continent. The old monarchies regarded him with suspicion and hostility. Austria, Russia, Britain, and later Prussia saw in Napoleon not only a rival, but a threat to the very order of Europe. They believed kings ruled by divine right, that crowns passed from father to son by ancient lineage. Napoleon, a Corsican soldier who had crowned himself, was an insult to their traditions and a challenge to their authority. And so they gathered their armies, determined to crush him. Napoleon, however, thrived on such challenges. His army, now known as the Grande Armée, was the most formidable fighting force in Europe. It was vast, disciplined, and loyal, composed of soldiers who had followed him from Italy to Egypt, men who believed in his genius and shared in his glory. They marched swiftly, fought with courage, and trusted their emperor to lead them to victory. One of his earliest and greatest triumphs came in the year 1805 at the Battle of Austerlitz. Known as the Battle of the Three Emperors, it pitted Napoleon against the combined forces of Austria and Russia. The battlefield stretched across rolling hills and misty valleys in Moravia, and Napoleon, though outnumbered, devised a plan of extraordinary cunning. He deliberately appeared weak, leaving his right flank exposed. The Allies, believing they had found a vulnerability, attacked with confidence, but it was a trap. As they pressed forward, Napoleon launched a devastating counterattack at the centre, splitting their army in two. French forces surged across the field, encircling and overwhelming their foes. The sun broke through the mist, and ever after, Napoleon's soldiers would remember the Sun of Austerlitz as the symbol of their greatest victory. The Allies were shattered, their armies in retreat, and Europe stood in awe of Napoleon's brilliance. The defeat forced Austria to make peace, signing the Treaty of Pressburg. the old Holy Roman Empire, already weakened, began to crumble. Napoleon reorganized Germany into the Confederation of the Rhine, a network of states loyal to him, further tightening his grip on Central Europe. But even as Austria bowed, new enemies rose. In 1806, Napoleon turned against Prussia, whose proud army was said to be the finest in Europe. At the twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt, however, his Grande Armée swept them aside with astonishing speed. In a single campaign, the Prussian army was destroyed, its capital of Berlin occupied. Napoleon walked the streets of the city as master, issuing decrees that reshaped the continent. From Berlin, he announced the Continental System, an economic blockade designed to weaken Britain by closing Europe's ports to its trade. The victories kept coming. Russia remained in the fight, and in 1807, the two powers clashed at the Battle of Friedland. Once again, Napoleon's maneuvers proved decisive. The Russian army was crushed, and Tsar Alexander I was forced to seek peace. The two emperors met on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River, where they signed the Treaty of Tilsit. For a moment, Europe seemed divided between Napoleon and the Tsar, with the rest of the continent at their mercy. Napoleon's empire reached its height. From Spain to Poland, from the North Sea to the Adriatic, his influence stretched across nearly all of continental Europe. He placed family members on thrones. His brother Joseph became King of Spain, his brother Louis King of Holland, his brother-in-law Joachim Murat King of Naples. His rule was not only military but dynastic, as he sought to found a new order that would endure through his lineage. But the very scale of his power sowed the seeds of future troubles. The continental system strained economies and bred resentment. Conquered peoples, at first hopeful of liberty, grew weary of French rule. In Spain, resistance turned into a brutal guerrilla war, draining French strength. In Britain, trade found ways to bypass the blockade, keeping Napoleon's rival alive and determined. Still, for a time he seemed unstoppable. In battle after battle, he demonstrated not only tactical brilliance, but also personal courage. He rode among his soldiers, shared their hardships, and inspired them with his presence. They saw him as more than an emperor. They saw him as their leader, their symbol of victory. Yet, even the brightest sun casts shadows. The wars that brought Napoleon glory also brought endless bloodshed. Tens of thousands fell at Austerlitz, at Jena, at Friedland. Cities burned, families grieved, and whole nations bent beneath the weight of his ambitions. Europe was dazzled by his brilliance, but also exhausted by his conquests. At the height of his power, Napoleon stood as master of Europe. No general had achieved such dominance since the days of Charlemagne, perhaps since Rome itself. He had risen from a Corsican outsider to command emperors and kings, to redraw maps, to place crowns upon his own head and those of his brothers. But the wheel of fortune never stops turning. Even as he revelled in triumph, cracks were forming in the empire he had built. In Spain, resistance gnawed at his armies. In Russia, uneasy peace simmered beneath the surface. And in Britain, across the sea, his greatest enemy remained unbroken, watching and waiting for its chance. For now, however, the world belonged to Napoleon. From the Sun of Austerlitz to the treaties signed on rivers and in palaces, he had carved his name into history as a master of war, a ruler of nations, and the architect of a new Europe. But the higher a man climbs, the further he has to fall. And Napoleon's fall, when it came, would begin in the very lands that had once brought him triumph. At the height of his power, Napoleon Bonaparte seemed invincible. He had defeated Austria, humbled Prussia, and forced Russia into uneasy alliance. His family sat on thrones across Europe, his laws reshaped nations, and his armies marched wherever he willed. Yet even for the greatest of conquerors, there are limits. And for Napoleon, those limits revealed themselves not in one decisive battle, but in long, grinding struggles that drained his strength. The first wound came in Spain. In 1808, Napoleon sought to tighten his grip on the Iberian Peninsula. He forced the Spanish king to abdicate and placed his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the throne. To Napoleon, it seemed a simple move. Replace a weak dynasty with one loyal to him and secure the region against Britain. But Spain was not so easily subdued. The Spanish people rose in fury. Cities erupted in revolt, villages armed themselves, and guerrilla bands harassed French soldiers at every turn. The Peninsular War, as it became known, was unlike the battles Napoleon had mastered. Instead of grand maneuvers and decisive engagements, it was a war of ambushes, raids, and brutal reprisals. French columns marching through the countryside found themselves attacked by peasants with muskets, knives, even farm tools. The resistance was relentless, and it spread like wildfire. To make matters worse, Britain seized the opportunity. Under the leadership of General Arthur Wellesley, later known as the Duke of Wellington, British forces landed in Portugal and soon pushed into Spain. From their bases along the Atlantic coast, they supplied the guerrillas, fought pitched battles, and turned the Iberian Peninsula into a bleeding wound for Napoleon's empire. Napoleon himself marched into Spain, determined to crush the resistance. He won battles, driving back British forces and capturing Madrid. Yet even as he achieved victories, the war refused to end. The Spanish spirit would not be broken, and the rugged terrain favoured the defenders. Every French success was followed by new uprisings, new ambushes, new losses. Napoleon began to call Spain his ulcer, a festering wound that would not heal, draining men and resources year after year. But if Spain was a slow, painful struggle, Russia was a catastrophe. The uneasy friendship sealed at Tilsit between Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I had begun to crumble. Russia resented the continental system, which disrupted its trade and weakened its economy. Napoleon's dominance over Europe bred suspicion, and Alexander's pride bristled at being treated as a junior partner. By 1812, the alliance was broken, and war was inevitable. Napoleon assembled the largest army Europe had ever seen, the Grande Armée, numbering more than 500,000 men drawn from across his empire. French, Germans, Italians, Poles, Dutch, all marched east under the imperial eagle. The plan was simple: invade Russia, defeat its armies swiftly, and force the Tsar back into alliance. But Russia was unlike any land Napoleon had faced. The distances were immense, the roads poor, the climate unforgiving. The Russians, rather than offering battle, retreated steadily, drawing the French deeper into their vast country. As they withdrew, they burned crops, villages, and supplies, leaving nothing for the invaders to seize. The French advanced, but their supply lines stretched thin, their men weakened by hunger and exhaustion. At last, in September, the Russians made a stand near a small village called Borodino. The battle was one of the bloodiest of the age. From dawn until dusk, cannon roared and muskets cracked as armies clashed in ferocious combat. Napoleon hurled his troops against the Russian positions again and again, and though the French eventually forced the Russians to retreat, the victory was hollow. Tens of thousands lay dead or wounded on both sides, and the Russian army, though battered, was not destroyed. Napoleon marched on to Moscow, expecting that its capture would bring the Tsar to terms. But when he entered the city, he found it deserted. Its inhabitants fled, its buildings set ablaze. Fires consumed Moscow for days, leaving little but smoking ruins. Still, the Tsar refused to yield. As autumn turned to winter, Napoleon faced a terrible choice. To remain in Moscow was impossible. To retreat was dangerous. At last, he ordered his army to withdraw. The retreat from Moscow became one of the most harrowing episodes in military history. The cold descended with merciless fury. Snow and ice turned roads into death traps. Horses collapsed from exhaustion. Wagons were abandoned. Men froze in their sleep. Russian cavalry and Cossack raiders harassed the columns, striking at stragglers and baggage trains. Hunger gnawed at the soldiers, who ate whatever they could find: dogs, horses, even scraps of leather. Discipline broke down, and the once mighty Grande Armée dissolved into a desperate mob. Of the 500,000 men who had crossed into Russia, only a fraction returned. The rest lay dead in the snow, or scattered across the steppes, prisoners or deserters. Napoleon, who had seemed invincible at Austerlitz and Jena, now faced ruin. The twin struggles of Spain and Russia marked the turning of the tide. For years, Napoleon had been master of Europe, bending nations to his will. But the ulcer in Spain bled him slowly, while the winter of Russia struck a blow from which his empire could never fully recover. His enemies, once divided, began to unite again, sensing that the giant could be toppled. Yet Napoleon was not finished. His spirit, though battered, remained unbroken. He returned to France, raised new armies, and prepared to fight once more. But the tide of history had shifted. The man who had once crowned himself emperor, who had commanded the sun to shine at Austerlitz, would now face the long, painful road toward downfall. The retreat from Russia shattered Napoleon's aura of invincibility. The Grande Armée, once the pride of Europe, had been reduced to a shadow of itself, and the loss reverberated across the continent. Enemies who had once cowered before him now sensed weakness. Austria, Prussia, Britain, and Russia formed a new coalition, determined to bring down the man who had dominated Europe for more than a decade. Napoleon, however, did not surrender to despair. With astonishing energy, he raised new armies, conscripting young men to replace the veterans lost in the snows of Russia. In 1813, he marched once more, determined to defend his empire. At Lutzen and Bautzen, he won hard-fought victories, showing that his genius for battle was not extinguished. His soldiers still followed him with loyalty, and his presence on the field still inspired courage. Yet the scale of the struggle was against him. The coalition armies learned from past defeats. They avoided direct battle when possible, wearing him down, striking at his flanks, and cutting off his allies. At Leipzig, the so-called Battle of Nations, Napoleon faced a vast army of Austrians, Prussians, Russians, and Swedes. For 3 days, the fighting raged, with cannon fire echoing across fields and villages. At last, overwhelmed by sheer numbers, Napoleon was forced to retreat. It was the largest battle Europe had seen until that time, and it marked the beginning of the end. As his enemies pressed forward, Napoleon fought desperately to defend France itself. In the campaign of 1814, he displayed brilliance once more, winning a series of victories in what became known as the 6 Days Campaign. With swift marches and daring manoeuvres, he struck at larger armies, defeating them one by one. His genius blazed as brightly as ever, but the odds were insurmountable. There were too many enemies, too many fronts, too little time. In April of that year, Paris itself was captured. The Senate declared him deposed. Napoleon, at last, was forced to abdicate. Yet even in defeat, he bargained for dignity. He was granted sovereignty over the small island of Elba, off the coast of Italy. There, the man who had ruled an empire settled into exile, accompanied by a small guard and a court that was but a shadow of the splendor he had once known. On Elba, Napoleon threw himself into work, as was his nature. He organized the administration of the island, improved roads, and inspected fortifications. Yet his restless spirit could not be confined. He read newspapers from France, hearing of discontent with the restored Bourbon monarchy, of soldiers and citizens who longed for his return. The thought of living out his days in obscurity gnawed at him. Napoleon had once crowned himself emperor, commanded kings, and marched across Europe. Could such a man fade quietly into history? The answer came in the spring of 1815. Escaping his guards, Napoleon sailed from Elba with a handful of followers and landed on the coast of France. As he marched north toward Paris, soldiers sent to stop him instead joined him. When he confronted one regiment, he stepped forward, opened his coat and declared, "If any of you would kill your emperor, here I am." Instead of firing, the soldiers cheered. His march became a triumph. Towns welcomed him, troops rallied to his side, and within weeks he entered Paris once more, greeted by adoring crowds. Thus began the 100 Days. For a brief, astonishing moment, Napoleon was restored to power. He promised peace, reform, and a renewed France. Yet his enemies did not wait. The coalition, determined to end his reign forever, gathered their armies once more. Napoleon knew that only a swift, decisive campaign could save him. In June, he marched into Belgium to strike before the coalition forces could fully unite. At Ligny, he defeated the Prussians, driving them from the field. But at Quatre Bras, the British, under the Duke of Wellington, held firm. Napoleon turned to face them near the village of Waterloo. On the morning of June 18th, 1815, the two armies stood across from one another. The fields were sodden from rain, delaying Napoleon's attack. When at last the battle began, French infantry surged forward, artillery thundered, and cavalry charges swept across the muddy ground. For hours, the outcome hung in the balance. Napoleon's men captured key positions, but Wellington's army held, fighting from behind ridges and farmhouses. Late in the day, as Napoleon prepared one final assault, the Prussians arrived on the battlefield, marching hard from their defeat at Ligny. Their intervention tipped the scales. French lines buckled, then broke. The Grande Armée, once again, was in retreat. Waterloo was not merely a defeat, it was the end. Napoleon returned to Paris, but the city had lost faith. The Chamber of Deputies demanded his abdication, and this time there would be no Elba, no return. He surrendered to the British, hoping perhaps for asylum, but they chose exile instead. Far across the seas, on the lonely island of Saint Helena in the South Atlantic, Napoleon was sent to live out the rest of his days, watched by guards, surrounded by ocean. The fall of Napoleon was as dramatic as his rise. From the heights of Austerlitz to the snows of Moscow, from the coronation in Notre Dame to the final field of Waterloo, his life had been a whirlwind of glory and ruin. He had reshaped Europe, inspired soldiers and terrified kings. And though his empire was gone, his legend would endure, as bright and as haunting as the Sun of Austerlitz itself. The final journey of Napoleon Bonaparte carried him far from the battlefields of Europe, far from the palaces of Paris, far even from the shores of his beloved Mediterranean. After Waterloo, after abdication, after surrender, he was sent across the seas to a place from which there could be no escape, the island of Saint Helena. Saint Helena lay in the vast expanse of the South Atlantic, thousands of miles from Europe, a rocky and windswept island, known more for its isolation than for any beauty. It was chosen by the British precisely because it was so remote. There would be no daring rescue here, no triumphant return as from Elba. This was to be the stage for Napoleon's final act, the place where the conqueror of Europe would live out his remaining years. In October of 1815, Napoleon arrived aboard the ship Northumberland. He was accompanied by a small group of loyal followers, officers, servants, and companions who chose to share his exile. From the moment he stepped onto the island, his life was transformed from one of grandeur to one of confinement. His new home, Longwood House, was a damp, draughty residence on a windswept plain, surrounded by British guards and watched constantly. For a man who had once commanded armies and reshaped nations, the contrast was stark. Gone were the glittering uniforms, the cheering crowds, the maps of conquest spread across gilded tables. Now his world was reduced to a few rooms, a garden, and the endless horizon of the sea. Yet even in exile, Napoleon remained Napoleon. He carried himself with dignity, insisting on the title of emperor, refusing to bow to the humiliation intended for him. Daily life on Saint Helena was monotonous, shaped by routine. Napoleon rose late, often spending mornings reading or dictating his memoirs to his companions. He walked in the garden, though the climate often made such strolls unpleasant. Afternoons were filled with conversations, games of cards, and more writing. He dictated endlessly, determined that his story would be told in his own words, that history would remember him not as a tyrant defeated, but as a hero misunderstood. His writings were filled with reflections on his campaigns, his reforms, and his vision of a new Europe. He sought to shape his legacy, to present himself as a man of destiny who had carried the ideals of the revolution across the continent. He spoke of Austerlitz, of Jena, of the Code Napoleon, of the grandeur of his achievements. Even as he lived in obscurity, he dreamed of how the world would one day see him. The conditions of exile wore upon him. Longwood House was unhealthy, damp and poorly built. The island's isolation bred melancholy. Quarrels arose between Napoleon's household and the British governor, Sir Hudson Lowe, whose strict regulations made life harsher still. Letters were censored, visitors restricted, movement closely watched. Napoleon, who had once commanded the destiny of millions, now found himself subject to the petty authority of men he considered beneath him. Over the years, his health began to fail. The once tireless general grew weaker, plagued by stomach pains and fatigue. Still, he maintained his composure, refusing to show despair before his companions. He dressed with care, carried himself with pride, and continued to speak of battles and empires long past. His mind, though trapped on the island, wandered freely across the fields of Europe, reliving the glories of Austerlitz, the march into Italy, the thunder of cannon at Rivoli. For those who lived with him, the contrast was poignant. They saw both the greatness of his spirit and the fragility of his body. They listened as he spoke of Alexander the Great, of Caesar, of Hannibal, figures with whom he compared himself, men who had risen and fallen, but whose names had lived on through the centuries. Napoleon sought comfort in the belief that he too would be remembered among them. On May 5th, 1821, after nearly 6 years on the island, Napoleon Bonaparte died at Longwood House. He was 51 years old. In his final days, he had spoken often of France, of his son, and of glory. His last words, as recorded by his companions, were of France, the army, the head of the army, Josephine. He was buried on the island, in a valley shaded by willows, his grave unmarked by name, at his own request. Yet even in death, his story did not end there. Years later, his remains would be brought back to France, interred with honour beneath the great dome of Les Invalides in Paris, where he rests to this day, surrounded by the symbols of the nation he transformed. The exile on St. Helena was a quiet, melancholy end to a life of fire and storm. Yet it was also the final stage of a legend. Stripped of armies, thrones, and crowns, Napoleon became something else. A figure of myth, a subject for poets, painters, and historians. His fall was as dramatic as his rise, and his story, told and retold, became one of the great sagas of human history. Napoleon Bonaparte, the boy from Corsica, the general of Italy, the emperor of France, the exile of Saint Helena, his life contained triumph and tragedy, ambition and downfall, brilliance and folly. He reshaped Europe, inspired millions, and left behind a legacy that endures to this day. And so, as the waves broke endlessly against the cliffs of Saint Helena, the man who once crowned himself emperor faded into history. But in fading, he became eternal, his name forever bound to the story of power, glory, and the limits of human ambition.